They tore down a historic building, they destroyed museum-worthy art, and in its place, they built a monument, not just to money, but to one man's name. What rose on Fifth Avenue was more than a skyscraper. It was a statement, a collision of ambition, ego, and timing, built at a moment when New York City was teetering between decay and reinvention. The site had once been home to one of the city's most elegant department stores, a showcase of fashion and modern art, but that legacy was erased, literally, to make room for something louder, shinier, and far more divisive: Trump Tower. So, how did this building that began as a bold real estate gamble come to symbolize so much more? Stay tuned to find out, as today we cover the rise of Trump Tower. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Let's go back to a time before the Golden Escalator, before department stores, or before anyone knew just what Fifth Avenue would become. For most of the 19th century, Fifth Avenue was nothing like the glittery stretch that it is today. It was unpaved, lined with brownstone townhouses and trees, and had a reputation not for shopping, but for stature. In fact, if you were anyone in New York society, especially after the Civil War, Fifth Avenue was the only place you wanted to be. The street first rose to prominence thanks to a deliberate shift in where wealth and culture chose to plant themselves. While downtown bustled with commerce and chaos, uptown, specifically around what is now Midtown, became the canvas for a different kind of power. Residences began climbing the numbered street above 42nd, and with them came the titans of New York. Names like Astor and Vanderbilt made their mark here, sometimes quite literally. Take Caroline Astor, monarch of one of New York's most formidable families, ruled the city's social hierarchy from her mansion on 34th and 5th. Just a little further up, the Vanderbilts built an extravagant cluster of mansions, which some critics dubbed Vanderbilt Row. To make a point, Fifth Avenue wasn't just an address, it was a throne. But the reign of private mansions wasn't meant to last forever. As Manhattan continued its vertical evolution, the land itself became more valuable than the elegance sitting on top of it. By the early 20th century, the same families who had built their legacies there were watching as commerce closed in around them. The block where Trump Tower would eventually rise, 725 Fifth Avenue, was part of this transformation. Once lined with private homes, the site sat just off the corner of 56th Street, a location increasingly eyed by developers and department store magnates looking to capitalize on New York's booming consumer culture. And so, as the Jazz Age roared into the 1920s, the residences on that block fell one by one to the demolition crews. The future of Fifth Avenue was no longer residential, it was retail. What replaced those homes would define luxury and modernity for an entire new era. Enter Bonwit Teller, a name that would shine in gilded letters long before anyone had ever heard of Trump Tower. Before Fifth Avenue became a shrine to brand names and skyscrapers, one immigrant, with an eye for elegance, made his mark there by redefining what a store could be. Paul Bonwit was born in Hanover, Germany. Like many immigrants of his generation, crossed the Atlantic seeking something bigger, though he arrived not with wealth or social standing, but with ambition to make something of himself in America's most relentless city. By the 1880s, he began working as a clerk in a dry goods store in New York City. This was hardly glamorous work, but it offered Bonwit a front row seat to the world of retail and to the possibilities it held. He quickly developed a reputation for sophistication and taste, not in a pretentious sense, but in the way he understood what well-to-do women wanted from a shopping experience. In 1895, Bonwit opened a small millinery shop bearing his name, Bonwit Teller Company, a venture done in partnership with Edmund D. Teller. The shop specialized in high-end women's fashion and accessories, catering to an elite clientele who expected more than just merchandise. They expected atmosphere, discretion, and beauty. Bonwit understood this intuitively. He designed his stores with opulent interiors and showcased the merchandise like it belonged in a saloon, not a warehouse. His displays became legendary, sometimes bordering on theatrical. Over time, Bonwit Teller became one of the city's most iconic luxury retailers, setting himself apart not just for what he sold but for how it was sold. By the 1920s, with the company flourishing, Bonwit set his sights on something grander, a flagship location that would reflect the stature of his brand. Fifth Avenue, now transformed from a street of homes to a corridor of culture and commerce, was the natural choice. Specifically, the prized corner of 5th and 56th Street, just a few blocks south of Central Park, and directly in the gravitational field of Manhattan's most elite real estate. This was the site where Bonwit Teller would construct its crown jewel, a department store unlike any other, built not just to sell clothing, but to radiate sophistication. The building that arose here in 1929 was more than just a store, it was a statement. Designed by the renowned architecture firm Warren Wetmore, best known for Grand Central Terminal, the Bonwit Teller Building fused modern elegance with that classic Art Deco zest. The building was 11 stories tall, clad in limestone with elegant bronze grillwork over the entrance and 2 sculpture relief panels dancing high above the 8th floor. Though inside it was no less impressive, with sweeping interiors, mirrored surfaces, and softly glowing chandeliers, the space felt more like a luxury hotel lobby than a retail environment. Even the window displays were elevated to an art form, literally, because Bonwit Teller became known for commissioning avant-garde artists to design its windows. For women of a certain class, shopping at Bonwit Teller was a ritual. It wasn't a necessity, sure, but it was about showcasing their taste. The sales staff were trained to be discreet, helpful, but never overbearing. In many ways, the store reflected Paul Bonwit himself, elegant, measured, and always a few steps ahead of the trends. Though before the time the Fifth Avenue store opened, Bonwit had already stepped back from the day-to-day operations. He retired in 1929, the same year that the flagship opened its doors, only to pass away in 1939, having watched his modest vision grow into one of Manhattan's most respected fashion institutions. Bonwit was laid to rest in an ornate mausoleum in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, and it's worth pointing out that the mausoleum's architecture quietly echoes the same classical grandeur that defined his entire brand. Anyhow, as the decades passed, the store weathered both the Great Depression and the shifting styles of the post-war era. Throughout the mid-20th century, Bonwit Teller remained a fashionable fixture on Fifth, though it changed hands multiple times, from the Atlas Corporation to Genesco and eventually Allied stores. But by the late 1970s, the sparkle had finally begun to fade. New competition, changing retail habits, and financial mismanagement hollowed out the store's once grand image. And so it was. Allied put the site up for sale in 1979 and brought the end to an era. Just 50 years after it opened, the building that had helped transform Fifth Avenue into a luxury corridor was marked for demolition. It would be replaced not by another department store, but by something even flashier. A shameless, self-branded skyscraper that promised its very own version of luxury, as well as an entirely different kind of legacy. By 1980, New York was a city suspended between ruin and rebirth. The fiscal crisis of the 70s had left deep scars, but in the gaps, new ambition began to grow. And at least one man saw that chaos not as a crisis, but as a golden opportunity. Donald Trump was the son of a successful outer borough builder, but his ambitions were strictly Manhattan. By the time he bought the Bonwit Teller Building, Trump had already cultivated a public persona as bold and brash as the projects he wanted to build, and nothing would symbolize that ambition more than the demolition of a Fifth Avenue landmark. At this point, the Bonwit Teller Building had been in New York since 1929. It wasn't just a department store, it was an icon of Art Deco elegance. Its limestone facade was adorned with ornamental grillwork and paired with 15-foot sculpted reliefs high above the entrance. These sculptures were so notable that the Metropolitan Museum of Art had formally requested both the bronze panels and the limestone sculptures for preservation. Trump initially agreed on the condition that it wouldn't cost too much or slow down the schedule. But when demolition began in June of 1980, the sculptures were smashed into pieces without notice. The ornate grillwork vanished. Nothing was salvaged. When pressed on the issue, Trump's spokesperson, John Barron, told the press that the artwork had, quote, no artistic merit, and would have delayed the project for too long. Now, according to some sources, years later, Trump admitted under oath that John Barron was in fact himself. Regardless, the museum was stunned, recalling, quote, we are certainly very disappointed and quite surprised, said Ashton Hawkins, who at the time was a senior official at the Met. Another prominent gallery owner likened the destroyed reliefs to the architectural treasures of the Rockefeller Center. Even Otto Tegan, who designed the bronze panels, dismissed the excuse, recalling, quote, it's not something you could just misplace. He said it bluntly. But lost art wasn't the only thing stirring allegations and controversy. To bring down the 11-story building, Trump contracted a demolition crew that, in turn, hired roughly 200 undocumented Polish workers. These workers became known as the Polish Brigade. According to court documents and multiple investigative reports, the workers were paid just a fraction of legal wages. They labored without hard hats, gloves, or even masks, despite the asbestos swirling in the air. The more sensational news reports claimed that they also used sledgehammers and brute force to dismantle the structure by hand, further alleging that workers slept on the site and survived on very little food. These allegations are worth noting, but it is difficult to know what the press's agenda was back then, though we can put the press allegations aside for a moment to focus on the fact that when things finally pushed through to the courts years later, a federal judge concluded that Trump had knowingly conspired to avoid paying them. This case dragged on for years and ultimately was settled for an undisclosed sum, and the agreement remains sealed. Hence, we'll never really know the truth behind the story. Still, for Trump, the outrage was beside the point. The building was gone, the art was gone, and soon, the empty lot left behind would bear only one name, his. And now, it was a blank canvas, waiting for a very different kind of monument, one built not for beauty, but for branding. Trump Tower was designed by architect Der Scott, a man whose name is less familiar than his glass and bronze legacy. Scott wasn't new to Manhattan. He'd already made his mark with projects like the Grand Hyatt Hotel, another Trump project near Grand Central. But Trump Tower would be different. It wouldn't just be a building, it was a brand. Scott had studied at the University of Cincinnati and Columbia, and he specialized in commercial towers that didn't just meet the skyline, they punched through it. His architectural philosophy merged bold geometry with market-savvy practicality. Trump chose him specifically for that reason. He knew how to make a building that stood out and how to make it on a budget. The building broke ground in 1980 and was completed in 1983. It stands 58 stories tall, though Trump, true to form, marketed the building as 68 by skipping a chunk of floor numbers, adding artificial height to match its ambition. At 664 feet, it was the tallest all-glass structure in Manhattan at the time of completion, and one of the first to mix retail, office, and luxury residential units into a single vertical complex. The tower's architectural style falls under postmodernism, though its aggressive use of dark, reflective glass and angular setbacks gives it a distinctive 1980s swagger. It's flashy, geometric, and unapologetically slick. This was a monument to corporate luxury in an era of Reaganomics. The building's 5-story atrium was the centerpiece. Lined in marble imported from Italy, the walls glowed with pink and oranges under brass-colored mirrors and polished brass railings. Now, some of us might think that's gaudy, but others considered it to be rather regal. Anyhow, the real showstopper was the grand escalator, stretching up from the ground floor like a golden tongue. Surrounded by cascading interior waterfalls, live trees, and seating areas that mimicked a luxury hotel more than a typical Manhattan lobby. But behind the opulence was a clever deal with the city. You see, in exchange for creating a privately owned public space like the atrium or the garden areas, Trump was actually granted additional air rights, allowing him to build taller than the zoning laws would have normally allowed. In theory, these spaces were to remain accessible to the public during set hours, but as we'll see later, the definition of public was sometimes stretched. Trump Tower housed a mix of tenants from the start. The lower levels were occupied by high-end retail, including Gucci, while the middle floors held office space, much of it leased to Trump's own businesses. The upper floors were home to luxury condominiums, marketed to the elite and international investors looking for a prestigious Fifth Avenue address. Trump himself claimed the triplex penthouse at the top, modeling it after Versailles and filling it with gold leaf, marble, and opulent furniture. But building a tower like this in the early 1980s wasn't easy. Construction faced protests. Trump, however, pushed through with media-savvy aggressiveness, frequently calling in tips to reporters, giving guided tours to the press, and keeping himself and the building constantly in the news. When it opened in February of 1983, Trump Tower wasn't just another skyscraper. It was a spectacle. It stood out among the boxy mid-century towers surrounding it, its jagged setbacks and mirrored skin catching the sun like a cut gem. The building was designed to impress, and impress it did. But how the public perceived it, well, that would be a very different story. Upon that grand 83 opening, critics and the public alike just couldn't seem to look away. Some people admired its sharp, faceted angles and gleaming glass. Others saw it as gaudy, ostentatious, more fit for Vegas than Fifth Avenue. Whereas architecture critic Paul Goldberger, writing for the New York Times, called it, quote, a handsome shape in the city, but even he noted how Trump took that one quote and plastered it across the atrium like a Broadway revue. Trump didn't just build a tower, he promoted it like a star. And that was the point. For supporters, Trump Tower embodied success. It was ambitious, flashy, unapologetic. It didn't whisper luxury, it shouted it in gold. For skeptics, though, the building quickly came to symbolize something else: excess, ego, and then much later, a vicious debate about civic values. Let's start with the atrium. It was meant to be a publicly accessible space. It became a sticking point. Though technically open to the public under the city's zoning bonus deal, visitors often encountered private security, restricted areas, and conditions that discouraged lingering. In 2008, Trump was fined $10,000 for removing a required public bench and replacing it with a merchandise kiosk. Later, during campaign events, the atrium was closed to the public entirely, again, in violation of that agreement. Still, the tower thrived as a brand beacon. Inside, tourists snapped selfies beside cutouts of Trump and browsed the Trump store, filled with cologne, cufflinks, and campaign gear. The building also became a backdrop to The Apprentice, further blurring the line between business, entertainment, and self-promotion. By the time Trump descended the Golden Escalator in 2015, though, to announce his presidential campaign, Trump Tower had become more than just a building, it was a stage. The scene, music blaring, flags waving, marble glowing, felt choreographed. And from that moment on, public perception of the building splintered even further. To supporters, the tower became a kind of shrine, a symbol of an outsider crashing through the political class. Fans visited in droves, hoping to catch a glimpse of Trump, or in the worst-case scenario, stock up on some MAGA hats and Trump-themed chocolate bars. To critics, it became the epicenter of controversy. Protesters gathered regularly outside its doors as a way to showcase their outrage about Trump's perspectives. And as you might imagine, this caused some complication. During the campaign, Fifth Avenue near the building was frequently closed and barricaded. This created tension between security forces, businesses, and pedestrians. For nearby retailers, the disruption was measurable and expensive. Even the building's tenants weren't immune. In some cases, residents and commercial occupants faced backlash or chose to quietly move out. The Trump name, once seen as a shorthand for luxury, began to polarize customers and clients alike. But the most dramatic shift came in November of 2016, when Donald Trump won the presidency. Suddenly, Trump Tower wasn't just a real estate success story. In some ways, it was seen as a shadow capital. In the weeks following the election, the building transformed into a high-security fortress. Barricades, armored vehicles, and Secret Service agents surrounded the entrance. The FAA designated the airspace above it as restricted. Tourists still came, but now they were flanked by metal detectors and bomb-sniffing dogs. Trump himself conducted much of his presidential transition from the tower. World leaders were ushered into the gilded elevators. Cabinet picks were made in offices just floors above where tourists bought souvenirs. It was surreal. For months, 725 Fifth Avenue stood as both a campaign headquarters and then a presidential outpost. A tower that once sought to represent success now found itself representing something entirely else. A nation in divide. Revered and reviled. Admired and protested. And then, as Inauguration Day approached, the man who built it seemed to leave the tower behind, but this time for the White House. As Donald Trump entered the White House in January of 2017, Trump Tower remained behind as something more than a building. It had become a monument frozen in transition. Part campaign headquarters, part luxury residence, part security nightmare, and for a brief moment, something like the White House North. In the early months of Trump's presidency, Trump Tower was the backdrop to meetings that had the world watching. Japan's prime minister stopped in. So did the British politician Nigel Farage, who posed beaming in front of the Golden Elevator. Other foreign dignitaries passed through its mirrored halls as well, often surrounded by press photographers and protest signs. Though perhaps what mattered most was that every arrival and every handshake was a televised spectacle. The building itself had to adapt. The Secret Service reportedly leased an entire floor to support presidential protection operations, ironically paying rent to the Trump Organization. The cost and optics of the arrangement were widely criticized, but legally permitted. Meanwhile, tenants and nearby businesses endured ongoing disruptions. Fifth Avenue closures, invasive security, and a persistent ring of barriers that kept Manhattan life at bay. And things went on this way. Despite moving his formal residence to the White House, Trump frequently returned to Trump Tower during the presidency, though less often as time went on. Still, the building loomed large. Campaign meetings continued there, fundraising calls were made from there, and for loyal supporters, it remained a destination. But as Trump's presidency unfolded, the perception of the tower evolved yet again. In the wake of controversial policies and national protests, some retailers quietly pulled out. One of the 2 Trump-branded stores in the atrium was eventually removed as well. The public spaces, already notorious for being less than welcoming, felt even more restricted. According to reports from Untapped New York, the supposedly accessible atrium and gardens were often partially closed, repurposed, or simply made inhospitable for loitering. And although things somewhat calmed down after Trump's first term, the lull was only temporary, because then came Trump's second campaign. Once again, Trump Tower buzzed with activity. Cameras staked out the front entrance, staffers filed in and out, and in many ways, the tower became an even more powerful image for his brand. Figures such as Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and the President of Poland, Andrzej Duda, made appearances. But the building's glamour was now wrapped in something grittier: politics, backlash, and fatigue. Over the decades, few buildings in America have reflected so many versions of the country's identity, real and imagined, as Trump Tower. Postmodern in style and unapologetically flamboyant, it stood out on a street that had already seen its share of grandeur. When it opened in 1983, it was a symbol of upward mobility, wealth, and a brash new vision of luxury. But as the decades passed, Trump Tower evolved from real estate into representation of many things. It appeared in The Dark Knight Rises as Wayne Enterprises, stood in for opulence in The Wolf of Wall Street, and was even rapped about by artists like Mac Miller and Young Thug, sometimes in admiration, but sometimes with irony. On The Apprentice, its facade became synonymous with the Trump brand itself. The point is that long before politics took center stage, it had already become a part of the cultural wallpaper. Yet, for all of its appearances, the building means different things to different people. To some, it's the embodiment of New York's success, bold, modern, iconic. To others, it's a cautionary tale about ego, erasure, and what gets lost when preservation gives way to profit. Today, Trump Tower stands as it always has, glass shimmering, escalators humming, and the name impossible to ignore. But its meaning, well, that's no longer set in stone. It changes with the decade. It may change again. So perhaps we can wrap things up with a simple question. What does Trump Tower represent to you? Let me know in the comments section below. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.